Welcome back. We now talk foreign policy with former Maine Senator and Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell. For a person who dedicated the majority of his professional life to public service, when you heard our president from that stage in Helsinki, when you heard what President Trump said in the aftermath of the Khashoggi murder, siding with the Saudi royals, when you heard that, I got to imagine there was more than a little cringing on your part.
Well, I think there was cringing on the part of all, particularly in the Helsinki press conference, because it was so obvious that the president would, in a news conference televised worldwide, take the side of the leader of Russia against the United States' own intelligence agencies. But I think that's part of a larger and more disturbing pattern. General Mattis resigned as Secretary of Defense, and in his letter of resignation, he set forth his principal concern, and that is the degradation of the alliances among Western democracies built by the United States in the aftermath of the Second World War. And that's a tribute to American leadership. It was Americans who led the way in creating these alliances, which the president has so strongly denounced and criticized and sought to end in a way that I think will, were he to be successful, be harmful to American interests. And one of the central ones is the alliance among democratic nations in Europe with the United States, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, the European Union, both of which the president has denigrated, has encouraged Britain to leave the European Union, when in fact the European Union has been a linchpin of the defense of Western democracy. President Trump is fond of saying it would be a good thing if we had good relations with Russia. Well, of course that's true. No one would dispute that. But it is a mistake to think that the reason we don't have good relations is somehow the fault of the United States. The problem is sorting out the blame, the responsibility, the changes that have been made, the changes that are necessary, and trying to do it in a peaceful but a resolute way in working with our allies in Europe and around the world who favor democracy and freedom and people being able to choose their own path.
I'm curious, right before the resignation of General Mattis, if you believe the timeline, a phone call between the president and Erdogan frustrated the president enough to say, fine, you take it, go ahead. And then we saw the dominoes that led to the resignation of the general and the rationales that he laid out. What concerns you more, that the president would act so impetuously without going through a chain of command, or that the messaging of that is to the Kurds or anyone else, yeah, we might have said we'd be with you, but you're on your own now?
It's an unfortunate message to the Kurds, but also to everyone else in the region, friend and foe alike. Remember, within 24 hours, the Kremlin had congratulated the president on the decision to withdraw from Syria. That makes it easy for them to continue their efforts to have an influence there, indeed a domination there. It sends a message around the world. We have alliances all around the world. And the message is a very disturbing one, is that not only will we not live up to our agreements with our allies, we will make decisions to end our alliances without even consulting with or telling the people with whom we are allied. That's one of the more disturbing things about it, and the message there is universal. It's not limited to the place where the event occurred in Syria. It's to people all around the world, I think to the ultimate detriment of the United States.
It went, I think, underreported when the French president said maybe we need to consider having a European military because of the concerns as to whether or not the U.S. would stand there. I'm sorry, if I'm in Kiev right now, I'm going to think twice about the window of time why Putin wouldn't be more emboldened now if he was going to take aggressive action into Ukraine under the Trump administration than what might follow. The idea that we wouldn't stand with an ally, I don't know. I don't remember that being a realistic concern in the past, but now, why wouldn't you take that seriously if you were Europe and saying, I don't know what the U.S. will do under this president if Russia took aggressive action and went into basically across borders? Would the U.S. stand with its allies of NATO? Why isn't that a legitimate worry?
It is a legitimate concern, but fortunately the president has made subsequent statements that contradicted his earlier statements that suggest the United States would honor the provision in the NATO agreement that makes an attack on one an attack on all. We don't know what would happen in the actual circumstance of such an event. It would depend obviously upon factors there. There's no doubt the Europeans are shaken. But I think my advice to President Macron would be to work harder to build and maintain a strong military force in NATO, and that it will be a whole new issue. And I think for them, in many respects, a whole new can of worms to create a separate European military force, creating a parallel effort with NATO.
I know you're familiar, Senator, with Bob Woodward's book, and in it, the reports that literally people were taking documents off the president's desk so that he couldn't put a signature or be made aware of it. Everybody knows he doesn't read policy briefing books. In fact, he talks at length that he doesn't need to read, he goes by his gut. To that end, one day, we're going to pull our troops out of Syria. Then Bolton says, never mind, don't listen to that. The president says he doesn't want to have any boots on the ground, basically in the Middle East. We need to be out yesterday. Then Bolton starts talking about aggressive action in Iran. You have Secretary Pompeo basically taking a completely different vantage point about our commitment to our allies than the president does. The point I'm trying to make is, how confusing is it at world capitals now? Who's speaking for the United States in our policies? Who's deciding what we do or don't stand for? The president can tweet something, but it seems that his own administration basically tells the world, don't listen.
Well, disagreement within administrations is not unique to this one. Every administration with which I'm familiar, going back many years, my service in government, had people who disagree on policy. The difference now is that the disagreements were internal and were thrashed out through an intra-agency process of meeting, discussion, debate. Disagreements were aired. People listened, presidents listened to both sides of the argument and then made a decision that everybody fell in line with. The problem now is that the decisions are made at the outset of the process. The president issues a tweet making a decision, and then the disagreements and discussion occur in a way that does create confusion and dissatisfaction throughout many of our allies around the world.
Senator, it's fascinating talking to you. I really appreciate the time.
Thank you, Richard.
And coming up next, yet another racially charged controversy from none other than Congressman Steve King. Will fellow Republicans finally act against their colleague from Iowa?